as well. There's good soil in every direction, and for many of the smallholders, this is the focal point where they can buy and sell their produce.
Sell us anything, you know. You really want as a banana.
In medieval times, however, it wasn't a market in quite the present-day sense, but a place where every street had its own trade, as they still do in some oriental towns. Close to the marketplace, evidence of medieval trade still survives. There were Butcher's Row, Mercer's Row, Tanner's Row, Fish Row, the Butter Market, and Pig Street, which was the swine market. These narrow little streets were abandoned by the erstwhile traders long ago, but the plan persists. A little later came the marketplace itself. Apart from agricultural produce, there was, as so often in England, wool. In the Middle Ages, this town's principal source of wealth was the wool trade. It was above all the wool merchants who paid for the lavish rebuilding of the parish church between about 1470 and 1525. But from the beginning of the 16th century, Chipping Walden began to be called Saffron Walden. And that's another story again. By this time, the saffron trade, just in this one corner of northwest Essex and the adjoining strip of Cambridgeshire, was becoming really important. The saffron is a kind of crocus, and it was first introduced into this country during the reign of Edward III. Here it is, Crocus sativus, the botanists call it. It starts blooming late in October and has graceful mauve flowers. Its primary use was as a dye, and the red stigmas produce not a red but a yellow dye. It was probably the local clothiers who first encouraged its widespread cultivation. So important did this trade become in the 16th and 17th centuries that the town gradually came to be known as Saffron Walden. The crocus was incorporated in its coat of arms. And since then, the name Walden has happily never shedded saffron. But early in the 18th century, cultivation suddenly ceased, partly because cheaper yellow dyes appeared. The crocuses gave place to barley. Early in the 19th century, this town was one of the three most important in Essex for malting. Ironically enough, it was also a stronghold of nonconformity, and especially of Quakers, who were often total abstainers. There isn't much evidence of the trade left in Saffron Walden today, but in Middleton Place, this late 15th century house still retains its sack hoist. This was added when the building was converted into a malting. The upper story, as we can see, is jetted. Of special interest is the pair of small four-light oriel windows with moulded sills. The original oak is still in excellent condition. This oriel window helps to light the long room of what is now the dormitory of Saffron Walden's youth hostel. After a long day's walk in the country, what a thrill to be able to wake up under this splendid 16th century double-framed roof with ties, collars, braces, and studs. The whole hosier shop, in fact. The braces are the curved pieces which run along the full length below the purlins, securing the structure longitudinally as the tie and collar beams do crosswise. At this end of the room, up in the roof, can still be seen the oak wheel of the maltster's hoist. Now this is one of the timber frame buildings of Saffron Walden which were formerly plastered over. And the same is true of a good many others, like this one. The plastering was done partly for comfort. It excluded at least some of the draughts, to which, as anyone who's ever lived in a timber-framed house will know, such buildings are by no means inaccessible. But from the middle of the 17th century, it was also for appearance. It was now felt to be better manners not to reveal the bones below the skin, as it were. So one got this effect instead. Now, I don't deny that the exposed oak timbers which are fashionable today can be very attractive. But once they've been plastered over, laths will have been nailed on to provide a key. Remove these and you'll find that the oak studs, as they're called, are pitted with rather unsightly nail holes. Yet the stripping off of old plaster still goes on, if less frequently than a generation ago. What is especially bad is to strip and then to blacken, as here. Black and white is a West Country affair, and anyway mostly Victorian. It has absolutely nothing to do with East Anglia. In my view, it's a cruel way of treating oak. Such a beautiful wood in its natural state. But if plaster is retained, it is often a good idea to colour it. And in this respect, in recent years, we've done well. Several excellent products are now available in a wide range of colours, of which people in Saffron Walden have taken full advantage. The plaster might also be made more interesting by the addition of pargeting. Pargeting was something of a speciality of this part of Essex. Put simply, it means the impressing of patterns into wet plaster. In olden days, the plaster would have been lime-based. Nowadays it varies. This is a good lime mortar, which will presently be whitened. There are two possible ways of pargeting, but most of it nowadays is in size, that's to say, pressed in to the wet plaster. Here are some of the tools which are used in the process. Well, now this tool is known as a comb, and it's used to make patterns like this. Which you can see distributed on buildings all over the town. Done much more competently than I can do them, I assure you. Now this is a wooden mould made of deal, and it's used to make a pattern which goes like this. In this kind of pargeting, the patterns are nearly always basically geometrical. And you can find this kind of pattern also widely distributed about the town. Now this is a very different affair. This is an oak mould about 100 years old, and not wholly geometrical for once, because you see here in the centre we have the three stigmas of our old friend the saffron crocus, and it makes a design like this. And using the mould 4 times over, you can see what a beautiful pattern you can get with the wooden part repeated 4 times, you see. Incised pargeting has a long history, but what we see today has practically always been renewed and can look very mechanical, especially when the wall covering isn't lime plaster but just cement, as here. Pargeting in relief is a much more interesting and ambitious process. This craft enjoyed its heyday during the 17th century. It also had to be done while the plaster was still wet. The designs might be modelled with the fingers, aided by perhaps a few small tools, or they might be impressed from moulds, which could be of beeswax, but which were more usually of wood, like this one. This is in fact incorporating a design based on a sheaf of corn. But here we have a trail of vine which runs along to the whole length of the front of the house. The panel with the gilded dolphin was brought from the former inn of that name in the marketplace. And that makes a very handsome addition to the wall. A favourite place for pargeting was the face of the summer, the massive beam which supports the joists of the upper floor. Unfortunately, the horizontal surfaces of this relief pargeting are all too prone to collect dirt, which mars the effect. They should receive the constant attention of a damp cloth. But the showpiece of 17th century pargeting in Saffron, Walden is undoubtedly the Old Sun Inn in Church Street. And whilst there is some fairly conventional pargeting here, much of it is quite unpredictable. Here are the figures of 2 men in 17th century costume. This one is reputed to be Tom Hickathrift, a famous East Anglian carter. The other is said to be the Wisbech Giant. They appear to be doing battle, with one of Tom's cartwheels between them. The legs of the giant did have to be completely renewed in 1966, and very well they did it. The work was modelled by hand in hair-lime plaster, just as in the 17th century. Not all this pargeting is unconventional, but it's lively stuff, and what's more, the man responsible for the restoration here says that it's entirely original. What a pity that relief pargeting is so seldom done today. No one would pretend that this is anything more than folk art, but as such it is rather delightful, and an exceptionally complete survival. The framework of all these houses, pargeted or not, is oak. In fact, this wonderful wood is never far from our thoughts, nor indeed from our eyes, at Saffron, Walden. But weatherboarding, which is usually softwood and scarcely ever oak, appeared in England a good deal later than the frame structures, and isn't common at Saffron, Walden. But here's an example, painted white. However, it was chiefly used in this town for barns, and for them the boards were traditionally tarred. This barn is also notable for the beautiful handmade tiles of its roof, although only a quarter of the original number survive. Elsewhere in the town there are still plenty of old handmade tiles, the rich colours and textures of which are a continual source of pleasure. In Essex, by the way, they're not the curved, wavy pan tiles generally found further north, but nearly always plain tiles. Because of the dearth of stone, Essex was one of the first English counties to adopt brick as a regular building material. By the time of Henry VIII, whole churches were being built of it, as well as some memorable houses. But in Saffron Walden itself, I don't think there's anything earlier than this group of lofty octagonal chimneys, probably Elizabethan, rising from moulded bases and linked together at the top. Here's another Elizabethan example, with octagonal shafts. As this chimney is 17th century, the house must once have been of that date too. But it was largely remodelled in the Georgian era, and the canted bays with their ugly windows are, of course, Victorian. But hiding under a Virginia creeper, which certainly has no business to be here, is a really lovely example of brick craftsmanship. Just look at the elaborately wrought surround to the door, with rusticated brick pilasters. This effect, commonly seen in stone buildings of the period, was achieved by chamfering the joints. Nearly all the best brickwork is in fact Georgian, although there are a number of buildings here which started life with timber frames and which were converted to brick at a later date. It was so much less expensive than pulling down one's whole house and building anew. This building, now the post office, was also originally a 17th century house refronted in the Georgian period. The French windows were inserted when later a first-floor balcony was added. This has since been removed, and it would be pleasing to see the original window restored. Still, it's a good building, with some fine brickwork. Rather surprisingly, considering the date, the front is still English bond. That's to say, the bricks are laid in alternating courses of all headers and all stretchers. By this date, the usual bond was Flemish, with every course consisting of alternating headers and stretchers. But look now at the coins of the projecting centrepiece. They are composed of specially soft bricks known as rubbers, which could be rubbed down to achieve the finest possible joint. Once again, the chamfering is excellent. Of course, all this elaborate brickwork wasn't cheap. What was needed was some sort of jointing which looked good, but which was less expensive than using all rubbers. Some of the houses here display that curious super refinement of Georgian brickwork known as tuck disappointing. By the addition of sand of the required colour, and also sometimes an oxide, it was possible to produce a mortar of almost exactly the colour of the bricks themselves. With this mortar, the whole surface was pointed absolutely flush. Then immediately, while still damp, these mortar joints were scored with narrow grooves no more than 1/8 of an inch wide. And into these grooves were pressed thin ribbons of a contrasting substance, generally white and usually chalk lime putty, as here. The first half of the 19th century saw a growing taste, here as elsewhere, for gaunt bricks made from local chalky clay, with little or no iron in it to stain it red. It's a very sober-sided material, indeed somewhat drab. At Saffron, Walden, people would often seem to have become bored with gaunt bricks and to have painted them. Personally, I'm quite happy about this. These people, despite their Quaker inheritance, evidently love colour. Here's some red brick painted in cool colours. And, given this rather imposing 19th century classical design, I don't object to this either. Generally, though, if a painted surface is required, as in the first half of the 19th century it so often was, stucco provides a more urbane finish. This handsome Regency elevation is also clad in cream-coloured stucco. Saffron Walden is very well endowed with trees, which figure prominently in many of the views, and a great asset they are. But here, at the upper end of the High Street, they do pose something of a problem. The street here widens out, but not nearly sufficiently to accommodate, of all varieties of tree, London planes, which were planted here in 1902. Initially, mainly because they weren't fully grown, they gave the High Street an almost continental appearance. But having become too big for comfort, these unhappy trees must now be subjected to drastic pollarding in the French manner. So, in the winter months, their poor mutilated trunks are not only no asset, but really something of an eyesore. I mention this because, welcome as trees so often are in towns, anything like an avenue of large trees is a doubtful amenity unless the street is really very wide indeed. The alternative would seem to be to plant only small trees in this kind of situation, and to some extent this is what has more recently been done. Elsewhere, of course, the incidence of trees can be a lovely complement to the architecture. Saffron Walden is not only well endowed with trees, it's also over-endowed with traffic. Here in Bridge Street, several properties have received direct hits, usually from lorries or motor bicycles. In the last few years, the 8 Bells Inn, a timber-framed Elizabethan building, has been struck no fewer than 6 times. What then can be done? Neither an outer bypass nor an inner relief road are financially viable here. The only hope is to signpost the through traffic by routes that avoid Saffron Walden altogether onto the new, still pretty new, M11 road, which after all was built just to carry it. It's the jetted buildings, those with overhanging upper stories, that are specially vulnerable. Here, the pavement has been extended, and luckily the old Sun Inn isn't on one of the major through roads. But the Bridge Street houses are, and sensitively designed bollards to protect the most vulnerable buildings would appear to be the only practical solution. The one thing which should never be contemplated is street widening. I would stick my neck out. I would even risk it to say to those responsible for looking after our old towns that if there is one immutable rule which should always be observed everywhere, this is it. No street widening. Within these narrow streets, we look in vain for stone. It's an area that yields very little natural stone, but the one exception is flint. This is also fairly rare, but how good it can look is well seen here at Swan Lodge, which used to be one of the entrance lodges of Audley End Park. This is an early Victorian flint building with brick dressings. But the place to see flint in quantity is the church. And a pretty nondescript impression it makes here, with lumps of chalk or clunch and odd bits of brick mixed in. The masonry of the lowest stage of the tower is equally crude. But as our eyes move upwards, they meet something very different. Fine quality limestone. This is, surprisingly enough, Monk's Park oolite, one of the Bath stones quarried near Corsham in Wiltshire. It was specially brought here in 1831 for the new tower and spire. It seems fairly certain that this tower carried no spire until the end of the 17th century. Then Henry Winstanley, a local man, designed the curious wooden lantern which we see in this engraving, apparently as a kind of tryout for the first ill-fated Eddystone lighthouse. But by 1831 the whole tower was in a dangerous condition. It was decided to demolish most of it and rebuild, adding an entirely new spire. The architect was Thomas Rickman, one of the most eminent of his day. He decided to use Bath stone because, although it entailed a long journey by canal and river, it was at the time one of the least expensive limestones in England. To support its great weight, however, the tower was given a lining of brick. It's less original, this spire, than Winstanley's odd lantern, but surely far more dignified. At Saffron Walden, we're conscious of its commanding presence all the time. In this exposed situation, some of this not very tough stone decayed. For the recent restoration, they went back to Monk's Park for some more. The absolutely correct thing to do, though not all was possible nowadays, since, alas, so many quarries have closed. One's first impression of the interior is of great nobility. Lovely proportions, a very lofty arcade. And just look at that soaring tower arch. The limestones, at any rate for the lower part of the piers, would seem to have been brought from Ketton in Rutland. But other limestones were used too, and up in the clerestory they used again clunch. How excellent is the almost continuous range of clerestory windows, mercifully free from platitudinous coloured glass. In the aisles, there is, unhappily, some Victorian stained glass of very feeble quality. The drawing is insipid, and it's so overpainted that very little light gets through, which is to deny, surely, what the art of stained glass is all about, or at any rate should be. The other main blot here, inserted as recently as 1924, is the reddish-brown oak rood screen. It was a gift which shouldn't have been accepted, and it's deservedly unpopular now. What a heavy lump of a thing it is, isn't it? It was a tragic mistake, surely, when they might have had, for instance, a lovely, elegant, open screen in wrought iron, if indeed they wanted to have a screen at all. Apart from the church, the only major stone building at Saffron Walden is Audley End House, erected by Thomas Howard. And when it was completed about 1616, it was the largest house in England, over twice its present size. Howard was James I's Lord Treasurer, and on the one and only occasion when he came here, James is supposed to have remarked that it was too large for a king, but I suppose it might do for a Lord Treasurer. From a distance, it looks fine. But close to, it isn't really the most beguiling of Jacobean houses. Nor, in truth, is it any longer a very Jacobean. Because of the absence of stone in the area, most of the local gentry built their houses of brick. Not so this grandee. For him it had to be limestone and nothing else. So much of the stone was brought all the way from Ketton. It was a colossal piece of extravagance. For a house as grand as Audley End, the use of stone was, in my view, perfectly justifiable. But because it was not a local material, the mansion does seem undeniably aloof. For this friendly little town, in which stone is notable for its absence, has never harboured any monumental ambitions. At Saffron Walden, it is the traditional materials which count. Wood, plaster, brick, flint. A perfect exemplar of the pattern of English building.